Today's session is titled Toward a Culture of Excellence, Management, Finance, and Human Resources for the Future of Catholic Schools. And there really could be two no better panelists or presenters today to discuss this than the two gentlemen sitting next to me. I'm going to give you a very brief introduction because, like all of our panelists, they need no introduction. But starting first with B.J. Casson. BJ, as you know, is the founder and chairman of the Casson Educational Initiative Foundation, launched in 2000 to establish private college, preparatory, middle, and high schools in economically challenged communities throughout the country. Obviously, BJ is closely associated with the miracle and true inspiration, which are the Cristo Rey schools. And we are very honored to have him here today for him to share his wisdom with us. Our other panelist comes with equal fame and equal credentials, and that is Mr. Richard Burke. Richard is the president and senior executive consultant of Catholic Schools Management. To say that Richard has his pulse on what is going on in Catholic schools and provides a depth and breadth of wisdom and understanding would be an understatement. So today, as we focus on different areas of best practice, I think, at least for me, one of the most important things is this is all of what we're talking about today is means to an end. And that's not to diminish it, it's actually to state how important it is. The better we do these temporal aspects, the more children we form in Christ's image, the better we serve our communities, and frankly, from a numbers, the more kids we can educate and give a great future. So that's why today's panel is so important, because if we get these things right, our mission is strengthened. So without further ado, I'd like to invite BJ to begin his presentation.
Well, good morning, and thank you very much, and it's a pleasure being here. And I'd like to thank the Roundtable for the past 7 years, the magnificent work that they have done for our church. The first point I would like to make is to recognize the heroic work being done by many superintendents of schools, and there's 10 or 12 of them in the audience here. It's no fun to have to rationalize a school system to fit today's economic realities, but despite this, much really good work has been done, and I applaud you. A case in point is the Pathways to Excellence in the New York Diocese, challenging the status quo and offering realistic solutions. Realistic solutions is to be commended and maybe even a model for other dioceses to eventually follow. And then there's the out-of-the-box thinking of our lead here, John Erickson, what they have accomplished in a short period by thinking outside the box in Patterson. So much is being accomplished, but the urgency of challenge, as we all know, continues. As John said, the purpose of this session is to identify some big ideas that can be debated and challenged in the plenary session, with the outcome hopefully being some programs that the Leadership Roundtable can do something with and pass them on to the church can take advantage of these. This morning I'm going to offer two ideas. The first is the current diocesan school model and school structure working, or should it be changed? I think it should be, and many dioceses think that also and are working on that. Second, whenever I hear, can Catholic schools be saved, it's always in the context of financial sustainability. I'll propose a coordinated national effort to advocate state by state supportive tax credit program for private schools. And there's been discussion yesterday with John and Christine, and I know a number of you are working on it within your individual states, but I'm looking to add leverage to what you're doing by this idea. I approach these two ideas from the experience of working with so many mission mission-driven educators who are involved in the 24 Cristo Rey high schools and the 63 Nativity Miguel schools. I'm not an educator, I'm a business guy. And it's from that perspective that I have witnessed organizational structures that work with impressive outcome data. The question is, can any of these ideas be implemented in a diocesan framework? I believe the answer is yes. What I'll quickly describe is how Cristo Rey and Nativity Miguel schools and their networks work. It will sound like nirvana, but I will tell you up front, these are relatively young networks, young schools, and there have been and continue to be challenging issues. And sometimes the resolution of these issues is like making the proverbial sausage. But in the end, they figure it out, and their performance and outcome data speak for themselves. It's noteworthy that in both of these networks, and when they're thinking about it, they ask the question, is this the best decision for the kids? I submit maybe that's what's missing from public education. The 63 Nativity Miguel schools today serve over 5,500 students in 43 cities, 27 states, and in an 11-month intensive curriculum that prepares inner-city kids for success in high school. 80% of Nativity Miguel school graduates graduate from high school. The 24 Cristo Rey High School currently enrolls 6,500 students. This year, 19 of the Cristo Rey schools have a graduating class. For 6 of them, it's their first. The class of 2011 more than doubles the size of last year's graduating class. And you heard Rob last night talk about the vision of doubling the number of schools. Every one of these students have been accepted into college, all 1,100, with aspirations not only to enroll, but to persist and to succeed. Now, what are the elements of these two networks that they have in common that might be transferable? First, each has 10 standards. The first of these is that it's Catholic. The second is who we serve, the poor. Cristo Rey has a tongue-in-cheek saying, if you can afford to go to the school, you can't. Second, these schools are independent with their own board and and are formal members of the network, which means they have to adhere to the standards. Third, each school uses the president-principal model, where the president is the CEO and the principal is responsible for the classroom. Fourth, these schools share best practices. As an example, all the development directors of both network schools 3 weeks ago were in Chicago to talk about development, with bringing consultants in to provide new ideas and best practices in the fundraising, which when you hear some numbers later on shows it's effective. Fifth, the need to raise funds. They have that in common. Nativity Miguel must raise 100% of their budget. Think of that. Terrible business model if you're a business guy. They have to raise 100% of their budget. Cristo Rey needs to raise money for capital expense funds. Last year, Nativity Miguel schools raised over $63 million. And Cristo Rey schools raised $32 million over and above the income that comes from the work program. Obviously, this is amazing and a tribute to these schools, but the pressure of fundraising wears on the leaders and inhibits the networks from expanding to meet the demand of the new schools. There is great demand for these schools out there, and especially for the Nativity Miguel. There has to be a different financial model to grow as well as sustain these schools. Sixth and last, transparency. Both networks have performance and outcome data on each school. The data includes test data, profile of the student body, salaries of staff members, and in Cristo Rey right down to the cost per mile to deliver a student to the work site. We had the fortune of having what I call a clear earth opportunity there weren't a lot of schools. There was only one, Cristo Rey, and there were 17 Nativity Miguel's when we started. And we used a consultant by the name of Mission Measurements to develop the basic platform so that the collection of this data it becomes easy for the schools. And the other one wasn't last. This is the last one, collegial visits, and this is very important. This is the quality control from the network, where a group of peers visit and review several standards with the school leadership. New schools have yearly visits for the first 3 years. Established schools receive visits every 3 years. And it's a two-way conversation. From when it's peer-to-peer, they're both learning. I've detailed this because I've always felt that small networks of diocesan schools would be a much more effective organizational structure versus a parish-centric schools reporting to the superintendent. New York City's pathways, New York's Archdiocese pathways propose a variation of this, and they call it regionalizations. What I vision is schools in a mini network, 6 to 8 schools, would have a board comprised of educators and local business people willing to support Catholic education. And I submit to you that you would be able to better attract people when you're talking thousands of kids rather than hundreds of kids. The parish school would have an advisory committee to maintain the parish culture, fundraising, marketing, yes, marketing, no empty seats. Financial controls would be part of this mini network's mission. Recruiting and training leaders and teachers and other HR functions would also be centralized. Finally, I believe the elements of what I just described can be replicated in Catholic schools, and I would love to see that. Now for the second idea, and which always is the elephant in the room, financial sustainability. I know you know this, but I'll restate it. The United States is the only major industrial country that does not financially support private and faith-based schools. This goes back to the 1830s when James Blaine proposed an amendment to the federal Constitution banning direct financial aid to educational institutes that have religious affiliations, read Catholic. It lost in the Senate, believe it or not, by only 4 votes, but Mr. Blaine went state to state, and all but 11 states have what's now called the Blaine Amendment. I believe that the time is now to seize on the growing state legislation allowing the use of tax credits to fund private religious schools. Here's the concept. States allow individuals and businesses, varies state by state, to reduce their tax liability by contributing to organizations that disperse funds to families to help them pay for their children's education. These organizations, this is the most important part, are independent of the state bureaucracy. The dollar doesn't go through the hands of the bureaucracy. Importantly, in these budget stress times, a case can be made that tax credits actually save money. A nonpartisan report prepared by the Florida Legislature Office of Program Policy Analysis and Government Accountability concluded that the taxpayers saved $1.49 for every dollar that they lost in tax revenue. So this is a cost savings plan. There are 9 states today that have existing tax credits for education and 13 states that have bills pending. Do we want to sit back passively and hope to further this trend? Again, I know a number of you sitting here today are working within your states. But I think what is missing is an overall coordinated state-by-state effort to be true and strong advocates to strengthen in additional states offering these credits. We should join forces with the organizations that are working in the area of school choice. The Center for Education Reform, who recently published a study about saving Catholic churches. the American Center for School Choice, who in April held a symposium entitled "Can Superman Pray?" Interestingly, this was sponsored by the Catholic, Jewish, and Muslim students at the University of California Law School. I went to that because of the title. And there was an Supreme Court judge, some high-powered lawyers in the area, all advocating and coming up with legal strategies on how to approach this. As you know, the Supreme Court this spring handed down a decision allowing the use of tax credits to fund religious schools in Arizona. This decision, I think, is the tipping point in a resurgent school choice movement and eventually offer Catholic schools the potential of significant new funding. The court effectively mapped a route for state legislatures to skirt the Establishment Clause. Catholic schools should not be bystanders, but national players. I propose that the Leadership Roundtable take the lead and establish a group that will first develop alliances with national organizations advocating vouchers and credits. More importantly, develop partnership with other faith-based school organizations, such as the Lutheran, Episcopalian, the Jewish Orthodox Union, and other, to present a united front in the advocacy in a lobby issue. This is a social justice issue. It's not just an education issue. We should more importantly develop tiger teams, one at the national level, and back up what's going on in the states to make sure we have the proper selling points, and the selling points that are specific to the particular state. But we've got to bring more leverage to this issue. And finally, I recommend the Leadership Roundtable bring this to the Catholic Conference and get their support. That's what's been missing, and that's what's needed. Times have changed, and times have changed in Catholic schools, and they operate the way they operate, and they're, in my opinion, change is good, it's tough, but it must be done. 2 ideas to challenge. Let's see what we can do with it. Thank you.
BJ, thank you very much. And now I'd like to invite Richard.
Good morning. It's an honor, a privilege, and a very humbling experience to be here with you today. I've been to the Leadership Roundtable meetings for several years, but this is the first year that there have been so many wonderful and experienced Catholic educators here, and so it truly is humbling to be with you. I thank each of you for what you have done and are doing for Catholic education, and I'm especially grateful for the ideas that were presented yesterday at this conference to help ensure the future of Catholic schools. I come to you today not so much to talk about the future. I come simply as a very simple practitioner who has worked in Catholic schools for virtually all of my adult life and who has educated 4 children in Catholic elementary schools, Catholic high schools, Catholic colleges, and graduate schools, so I've paid a lot of tuition, if nothing else. For all of my adult life, since I was 27, I've been committed to ensuring both the vitality and viability of Catholic elementary and secondary schools, and I've been truly blessed in my life to have been given the opportunity to work in this arena, first by Father Jim Finelli, Superintendent of Schools for the Archdiocese of Hartford, and by Archbishop John Whalen, the Ordinary of Hartford at that time, and then later by Monsignor John Myers, the then president of NCEA. Over these past 38 years, Catholic school management has worked with just over 3,800 Catholic elementary and secondary schools in the United States and overseas, and I'm delighted to say that the vast majority of those, well over 90%, are still open and continuing to integrate elements of faith with the learning process. In preparing for this session, our moderator, John Erickson, encouraged us first in a telephone conversation to be provocative, never a problem for me. I seem to create attention whenever I speak. And our executive director, Kerry Robinson, encouraged me specifically to use stories from the many client visits, and I'll try to respond to both of those, but with brevity. And with due respect to my friend and colleague, Lorraine Ozar, I want to say that the expected outcome of this session is that we will identify, hopefully, key characteristics of high-functioning Catholic elementary and secondary schools around the country, which I believe should be implemented for all schools as we wait for the Future is Now campaign that Frank Butler spoke about yesterday. In our telephone conversation in preparing for this, John raised what I thought was a most provocative question. He surfaced it a couple of times here this week. That is, why are Catholic colleges on a regular basis outperforming Catholic elementary and secondary schools in virtually all areas, but certainly financially? Indeed, that question, I believe, holds the key to moving toward a culture of excellence for Catholic schools. If Catholic elementary and secondary schools are to be vital instruments of ministry, education, and formation for generations to come, the issues of ownership, governance, sponsorship, and administrative leadership must be addressed head-on, separated, and in many cases modified significantly. I agree with BJ, the system as it currently operates is broken systemically and systematically, and it needs major adjustment. Father Theodore Hesburgh recognized this reality in 1944 when a student at the Catholic University of America in Washington, he proposed for his doctoral dissertation with the help of his advisor, Paulist priest Father Gene Burke, no relation to me as far as I know, proposed for the dissertation the then avant-garde movement called Catholic Action in advocating for a greater role of the laity in both the ownership and the governance of Catholic education. He was able to implement that goal for the benefit of the University of Notre Dame with a separation of ownership and governance in 1967. To hear him tell it, the 2 years prior to that were most difficult. And as he says in his autobiography, God, Country, Notre Dame, and I believe this was significant, quote, "We were dead set in this initiative against any system that would perpetuate the old system of clerical control," close quote. That model, which called for the owners to retain a limited number of reserved powers while turning over governance responsibility to a largely lay board of trustees, has now been adopted by the vast majority of the more than 200 Catholic colleges and universities in the United States. Anthony Breich and Peter Holland expressed a similar perspective in 1984 with the publication of Effective Catholic Schools and Exploration as part of the NCEA research initiative. They concluded in that publication that if the financial problems of Catholic elementary and secondary schools were ever to be solved, they would be so only if the issues of ownership and governance were addressed simultaneously. Prophetic in both instances. I submit that Catholic colleges and universities today are stronger and more viable than their Catholic elementary and secondary school counterparts because they have indeed embraced the concept that issues of ownership and governance are central to long-term viability and vitality. This is based on the premise and the truism that people respond to people, not to institutions. As you have heard, specifically, that initiative from people yesterday, as Frank Butler and Christine Healy spoke eloquently about the need to bring people together for the benefit of these schools. That premise has never been more true than it is today. I submit for our consideration that Catholic elementary and secondary schools not only become more sustainable, but more vibrant when the issues of ownership and governance are separated. Parish schools, as we have known them, by and large, will not survive. I believe that it is our responsibility collectively to assist bishops in recognizing that our overburdened parish priests and pastors oftentimes have neither the training nor the experience to carry out effectively the multiple complex responsibilities required in operating Catholic schools today. We've heard that a number of times at this conference and at prior conferences over the years. Since I have a limited amount of time, I will outline briefly 9 what I consider to be best practices to be addressed with regard to the management, finances, and human resources for the future of Catholic elementary and secondary schools in this country. At both the elementary and secondary levels, those schools which today are most financially stable are those which have already separated and clearly defined their responsibilities with regard to ownership and governance. And I've worked with a number of those at the parish level, the diocesan level, and the religious community-owned level. In each of these models, the responsibilities of ownership are clear, well delineated for all constituencies to see and to understand. These responsibilities are often referred to as reserved powers and may be carried out by a bishop, a pastor, a diocesan superintendent of schools, as the case in Bridgeport, a corporate board, or a canonical administrator. Most of you have already had an opportunity to talk to Margaret Dames and to learn about the work that Bishop Laurie and Margaret have done in creating an ownership model whereby all of the schools in the Diocese of Bridgeport are under the ownership of the diocese. But the concept of appointing a canonical administrator to oversee schools is relatively new, currently being supported by some foundations, and it's this model where a canonical administrator oversees the ownership responsibilities currently being utilized in the Diocese of Monterey in California. I give great credit to the leadership and indeed the courage of Bishop Richard Garcia in initiating this program and providing the option for his pastors to assign canonical responsibilities to a trained, experienced, and competent canonical administrator appointed by the bishop. There are specific forms for that to take place. In this model, the pastor retains his important role as spiritual leader while being relieved of the day-to-day responsibilities of ownership, finance, human resource management with regard to the school. In just one example, Father Ken Brown, currently the pastor of St. Patrick's School in Arroyo Grande, who utilized the canonical administrator approach 4 years ago when his school was faced with both enrollment declines and financial deficits. Today, the school is at capacity enrollment, breaking even financially annually, and Father Brown says, I now have the opportunity to interact pastorally with students, with teachers, administrators, and board members. The problems belong to the canonical administrator. Next, we have seen significant enhancement in school viability where governance structures are revised in light of modified ownership with increasing governance responsibility vested in the laity through the utilization of boards of limited jurisdiction. This, if you have an opportunity to read Father Hesburgh's dissertation, he talks about the characters, the imprints of the characters of the sacraments of baptism and confirmation. This is what brings to life the opportunity that we as lay Catholics have to serve on these boards, not simply in an advisory capacity, but in a capacity to govern these schools on an ongoing basis. It's these boards, typically referred to as boards of limited jurisdiction as defined in NCEA's Primer on Educational Governance in the Catholic Church, that are so effective when coupled with a new ownership structure utilizing a canonical administrator. Of course, board members need to be carefully selected and well trained, and here I give great credit to several religious orders, too numerous to mention here, and also the dioceses of Chicago, Monterey, Grand Rapids, Orange, and others, for moving in this direction and providing the extensive and ongoing training needed for the individuals involved. There's no doubt that they have the will and the desire to assist these schools, but the training is essential. That training is provided and must take place not only at the board level, but also for committee members. Committee members who may not be board members themselves need to understand clearly that their roles and responsibilities in relation to the board and in relation to school administrators. Committees need to meet separately from the board as a whole and provide the information needed to provide data-driven decisions at the school level. The most effective boards have not only been able to assist with strategic planning, but also with enhanced financial planning and management, with enhanced development programs. With these boards in place at all 3 Catholic high schools and 10 Catholic elementary schools in the Diocese of Houma-Thibodaux, Louisiana, a program begun in 1997-98 when annual giving, third source funding, for the total in the diocese was only $250,000. With these changes made and such boards in place, annual giving for 2007-2008, $2.4 million. Now, those numbers pale in comparison to the numbers that BJ spoke about, but significant, and no closing of schools in that diocese as a result of the restructuring, and I give great credit to Sister Immaculata Passant, Superintendent of Schools, who spearheaded that project. It perhaps goes without saying that excellent administrative leadership is one of the keys to the success of any Catholic elementary or secondary school. However, all too often, we find administrators working without clear contemporary job descriptions, minimal orientation, no annual performance evaluation. Conversely, we find on a regular basis that the most successful Catholic schools in dioceses or religious communities are those where owners and canonical administrators collaborate with diocesan superintendents to provide professional administrative training, clear and relevant job descriptions, annual, underline annual performance evaluation that is collaborative in nature, succession planning, clarity of roles, and clarity with regard to span of control issues. Indeed, the Leadership Roundtable, I believe, can be of tremendous help in each of these areas in creating and compiling the models and making them available across the country. Adoption of a new toolbox for best practices and standards of excellence would be welcomed in many areas of the country. The effective management of Catholic schools also relies on clearly defined and well-promulgated foundational documents, too often not discussed. These include the statements of not just mission, but philosophy, mission, vision, and the profile of the graduate at graduation. Indeed, while I can point to dozens upon dozens of schools that are thriving today with these documents in place as relevant and contemporary, in preparing this talk, I could think of no instance of a school thriving without these documents. By way of example, Bishop O'Dowd High School in Oakland, California faced serious problems negatively impacting upon its viability in 2004. Bishop Vigneron was seriously concerned about having to close that diocesan high school. He sought assistance in each of the above: a change in ownership, governance with a board of limited jurisdiction, a president-principal model, and a president with a clear vision came in, rewrote each of the foundational documents. They were approved by the board, including a vision which, quote, called for O'Dowd to be the most technologically advanced high school in the Bay Area. Today, the school is thriving at capacity enrollment and about to embark on a capital campaign for expansion and new enrollment. Given the abundant research on Generation X and Generation Y in this country today, it is critical that clear parental expectations be established, and more importantly, that Catholic school teachers and administrators and pastors take the time to learn from parents their expectations with regard to the Catholic school. This is most effectively carried out through the use of personal interviews for each family, parent, or guardian at the time of registration and each year at re-registration, coupled with annual parent satisfaction surveys, grade-level conferences, and coffees with the principal throughout the year. Parents have told us over and over again how much they appreciate that personal attention, a clear characteristic of Generation Y and younger Generation X parents. These best practices with regard to clarifying expectations most often result in not only full enrollment, but waiting lists across all demographic profiles, inner city, urban, suburban, and I suppose even leafy. At one school in Naperville, Illinois, the principal has been carrying out all of these best practices for the past 10 years. Despite the fact that a brand new state-of-the-art Catholic school opened just a few miles away just 4 years ago, St. Peter and Paul School has retained its capacity enrollment and satisfied parents. In what is called the ultimate question, would you recommend the school to others, St. Peter and Paul consistently gets a 98% plus rating. The sixth best practice relates to strategic long-range planning, which is essential for Catholic schools today and about which you have heard a great deal. It is also essential that it be carried out in a collaborative manner with input and participation from parents, teachers, administrators, and board members. Those schools that not only prepare and implement strategic plans, but promulgate them have seen growth in enrollment and resources. And here, following Carrie's suggestion for models, I couldn't resist. Just this past year, St. Mary Magdalene School in Camarillo, California, a suburban school, received a $250,000 gift. No solicitation done, no cultivation done, simply after promulgating its long-range plan that called for the integration of technology with the teaching-learning process in each grade. The donors found the plan to be compelling and well worth their philanthropic support. I could go on for 2 hours and tell you similar stories. I won't. With regard to financial viability, it has been true since I worked with my first client in 1973 that people respond to people, not to institutions, and that people will indeed invest their money where their heart is and where opportunities for success exist and are perceived to exist. The structures that I've outlined above with regard to ownership, governance, and administration facilitate this involvement and this investment. High-functioning Catholic schools operate with a well-structured finance committee of the board, and the finance committee works collaboratively and supportively, not in contradiction to. School administrators in terms of financial planning, budgeting, financial oversight, analysis, and financial reporting. Those schools that are most financially effective today are able to attract the most in third-party support are those that operate with a long-range financial plan regularly updated and based upon and reflective of the strategic plan. In other words, the finance plan should never, ever dictate the direction of the school. It should be the strategic plan that dictates the financial plan. A budget development process and timeline are clear to all and ensure that detailed budgets are in place before tuitions are set. Monthly financial oversight and analysis takes place as a matter of course, and annual financial reports in a spirit of transparency and accountability are presented in both print and on the school's website and in other electronic media. In addition to high-functioning schools operating with boards, the development or institutional advancement committees of the board are also essential. Interesting, it came up in our small group discussion this morning, and they are structured in such a way that the committee doesn't only seek money, usually a mistake, but rather focuses on communication, marketing, annual fundraising coordination, and plan giving. The most effective schools recognize the need to address communication and marketing issues before seeking external financial support. That's the reason why most school turnarounds from the brink of closure to viability take 4 to 5 years. In just one of the schools that I had to select from here, this is St. Philip the Apostle School. The pastor was, this was 17 years ago, reluctantly and fighting, brought into this process, but he made the structural changes that were necessary. The board was created. 3 years after the board was established and an extensive communication program launched, the school began its first program of annual giving. The pastor told the board and me directly they can probably raise $25,000. The communication program had been so effective, the first annual giving program received $102,000. Today, their annual giving approaches $200,000. They've completed 2 capital campaigns. The school has been completely revised, and it still serves a capacity student population. With regard to human resources, I give great credit to the University of Notre Dame and its ACE program, Loyola Marymount, Boston College, Loyola of Chicago, and others that have addressed head-on the issue and the task of preparing administrators for Catholic schools at all levels. This is incredibly important work. However, on a day-to-day basis, we find that succession planning is largely absent and yet essential at both the school and diocesan levels. Much more needs to be done in terms of preparation and grooming of assistant principals, particularly at the elementary school level, principals themselves, presidents, assistant superintendents, and superintendents. Moreover, from an HR perspective, those dioceses and schools that are most effective see diocesan superintendents or their assistants in the field on a regular, frequent, and consistent basis, working closely with schools in a proactive way to assist school administrators with myriad tasks that they face. As I was preparing this talk, one principal remarked to her superintendent just 2 weeks ago, "I've been a principal here for almost 10 years, and during that time, various bishops and each superintendent have talked about marketing and development programs. But during your tenure, you have been with us every step of the way, providing monthly resources to help us achieve those goals and teaching us, walking hand in hand with us. It's no wonder our school is at capacity and thriving." I hope that these 9 delineated best practices, I could not fit them on one slide without giving you an eye test, so you'll see them reviewed in 3 slides here, stimulate further discussion, the purpose of this meeting, continuing to move us toward a culture of excellence for Catholic schools. These 9 key characteristics will be essential for Catholic schools with or without vouchers or other funding initiatives. I've provided a more comprehensive list in a management letter that's on the table if you want to see all 38 of those, but these 9, I hope, will generate the discussion that Carrie, John, and the board of the National Leadership Roundtable sought. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. We're happy to open it up to questions for the panelists.
Kevin Kennedy. A lot of talk about evaluations, good job descriptions, and strategic planning. And in my experience, I've seen both, but often not connected. Okay. So do you have some good examples you can share with us where recruitment, retention, and reward really, and job descriptions, are based on strategic planning processes, like establishment of goals, and then we actually recruit, retain, and reward? Because what I find then is we can do strategic planning and come up with great goals, but then we have a completely distinct, separate recruitment, reward, and retention policy and system in place that's divorced from the goals. Thank you.
There are a number of schools, although far too few, that utilize those, but the premise behind your question is correct. If we tie them together, we do a much better job. I will refer you to Abbott Giles, who has in fact been perhaps a model of that at Del Barton in tying together strategic goals with the recruitment, retention, and the compensation packages for teachers to do just that. We were talking about it at dinner last evening, so I would encourage you to get together. And there's another model currently taking place in the Christian Brothers schools at De La Salle in Concord, California, that is remarkably well received as well. Perhaps some others, but some people right in this room.
And yes.
Hi, Bill McCursey with the Archdiocese of Boston. Wonderful presentations, and I would endorse the toolbox recommendation very much. Here's a question. I'm a former philanthropist. As you move to the regional academy models, and we have 5 of them in the Archdiocese of Boston, 2 benefited greatly from incredible philanthropy led by Jack Connors and others. 3 others we led with less philanthropy because of their great focus in 2 areas. Talk to us a bit about how you move on a regional academy approach, regional school model, when you have brought great philanthropy in but may not have it in other places. Because that question relates not just within an archdiocese, but diocese to diocese if we look at examples.
Okay. It'll vary obviously by diocese, but I think there is a fundamental tenet that one should think about. Philanthropists look at outcome data. If I'm going to invest $1, what is my return going to be? And we're not talking about economic return, but I just funded your program that had objectives and outcome data targeted. Did you meet those? So whether it's in a single school or a cluster, you call them academies, I call them networks, the same thing applies. And for a foundation to be looking at, I can invest in a program that will aid 5 schools, 8 schools, something like that, you've got a better story to tell. So it should, to me, it's an advantage, not a disadvantage.
As we look at the public sector, most change, if it's happened, has happened with some sort of incentive. Or you either push from an accountability standpoint, or the incentive is, here's some new money. We can just look at the effects of Race to the Top. That's public money. If we don't have the philanthropic help, can we still move on these regional structures?
We should be able to, because we have, but it takes a lot of hard work. You heard the numbers I gave up there, and those are significant numbers, but there's a lot of blood and sweat that went into achieving those numbers. That's why I'm really trying to pound the table here that we need a coordinated national effort relative to tax credits. That's the door that's open to us that has not been available up to now. Vouchers in most places don't work because they go through the system, and the faith-based schools are typically at the end of the line to get the leftovers, if you will.
If I could just add to BJ's, one thing that I know some dioceses have done, and it's worked to varying degrees of success, and we've at least tried it in one county, and we have challenges, but it works. We've actually hubbed 4 of our elementary schools with a high school. And so it's essentially K through 12 and we have challenges there. It's not to say we don't. It's actually been helpful as far as having we run the business operation out of the high school. We're able to do philanthropy and advancement on a larger scale. There's teacher quality issues. It's the bane of superintendent's existence, but when you refer to the specials, and trying to get quality teachers and having them shuttle, not be able to offer them full-time employment or benefits or pension. I mean, these are really sort of functional challenges. And although when I proposed this a couple weeks ago, it was labeled as Robin Hood, we make money in 2 of our elementary schools. In our high school, we break even at 1, and we lose money at a 4th elementary school. And because of the way we have set it up with the pastors, with sort of what the commitments are, we run a loss leader school. And, we're responsible for it, and it's not egregious, but we make money at certain schools and we transfer it to others. And it works in this county because there's a homogeneity of the population and a commitment to Catholic education, and we're upfront with it. It's a derivation. It wouldn't necessarily work everywhere, but we have a pretty strong high school up there that is really sort of an engine for us. The high school views it in its advantage because it views, although the elementary schools don't feel this way, as its feeder system, or it's, you know, for where you come from, and so it's in that self-interest. The elementary schools view it as in their self-interest because they can access resources that they wouldn't otherwise be able to get. So it's just a different flavor of that.
It's another variation of the theme. Yeah.
Tom Healy, a quick comment and a question. The comment is really striking that both of you talked about changes in governance models as ways of making impact, because it doesn't cost much in dollar terms. It's not like building a new school or repairing a school. It's an inexpensive intervention. Having been through at least one, I know the blood and sweat and tears that goes into the actual reality. But it's neat to have an idea that it doesn't require development. My question is for Richard. The canonical administrator, how does that work with the president principal model? Is it different from that? Do you end up with a third role? Is that confusing? Maybe you can give us a little more on how the canonical administrator model actually works.
Back to the second or third slide there that says ownership governance. The key, Tom, is this. The parish schools, of which there are almost 6,000 in the United States now, looking at Dan to make sure I've got my numbers right, are parish-based. In canon law, the juridic person is the parish, and the canons define a juridic person as similar to a corporate entity, but define it as an organization that acts like a little child and needs an administrator, typically the pastor, to oversee the public juridic person that is the parish. In this model that Bishop Garcia has initiated with a great deal of advice from his canon lawyers as well as ours, the canonical administrator operates at the ownership level. The pastor signs a decree of specific delegation, turning back his responsibilities canonically with regard to that portion of the juridic person that is the Catholic school. The bishop then appoints a canonical administrator, usually a superintendent or someone very experienced, to carry out those reserved powers. Now, I say that with that detail because that is at the ownership level. Then there is still the board at the governance level. And what Tom's referring to, the president-principal model, is the administrative level of the school. So the president typically carries out the normative presidential responsibilities, oversight of budgeting, strategic planning, vision, institutional advancement, and the like, while the principal carries out the inside or COO responsibilities, faith community affairs, academic affairs, student affairs, and the like. Does that help clarify?
Can a canonical administrator do many schools then, he or she? It's not a full-time job.
You have a canonical administrator sitting here.
Please.
I'm Kim Przybylski, and I am the former superintendent of the Diocese of Monterey, and I was the one who spearheaded with Bishop Garcia this whole initiative of canonical administrator. And here's how I explain my role. There were 4 pastors who decided that they wanted me to be canonical administrator. So I become the bad guy. I am the one who steps in when there's a parent problem, a student problem, a teacher or a principal that needs to move on to greener pastures. So instead of the pastor taking on that confrontational role, I go in and I do what needs to be done, and then I leave because my office isn't there. Then the pastor can come in and be very pastoral and tell people why they need to remain Catholic, because they always tell you, I can't be Catholic anymore because of what you've done to me. But the pastor can go in and talk to this family on a pastoral basis and say, yes, you still need, this has nothing to do with your Catholicity. This is just an issue. So basically that's what's happened. Is it a full-time job? It depends on the time of year. You know, like well, you know, people don't get mad until May. Something happens to them in September, and then May comes and says, you know what happened to me in September? And you're thinking, okay. So anyway, it is a real full-time job. And it also really depends on how well the principal runs the school. The school that Richard talked about, Father Ken Brown, he had 2 miserable principals. The first one, it took me forever to push. I'll use the politically correct term, move out. The second one was relatively easy to move out because, anyway, he was. But now they have a principal who is wonderful, who understands the school, works well with both Father Ken and myself, and we've really moved the school to where it needs to be. So it is a real full-time job with all my other responsibilities. But it's great because it's a win-win for everyone, and things move relatively smoothly.
We're continuing to experiment with that under the foundation grant. My hypothesis, Tom, at this point is that it would be very difficult for a canonical administrator to deal with more than 5 schools at a time. You can hear from Kim what the difficulties are.
Jeff?
Could you please run through the arithmetic of the tax credits and the impact that it's had on the 9 states where it's been approved, and maybe if you can do it on a per student basis, so that we can relate it back to the question, you know, from how much of a overall contribution it could make to the offsetting of the total budget that we're trying to finance.
Yeah, the Florida study, they give $9,000 per student into the public schools, and they lose about $6,000 in revenue. So there's a delta there. These are approximate numbers to put them into what you're looking for. So that the $9,000, rather than going to the public school through the child to the public school, $6,000 gets lost from the tax revenue that's not coming in, but because they're not sending that $9,000 to the student for the public schools, there's the delta there of the savings. And after that study, that's when they each year the state has to approve how big that should be, that pool of money, and it's grown significantly, $80–90 million, something in that range. Does that answer?
In terms of the amount of money that would go per student to the educational process of the student versus the leakage, right, by getting the tax credit. So and how much would that defray from, either the tuition or let's take it this way. What's the average cost to educate a student? And right now at the Nativity Miguel, it's 100% coming from philanthropy. Right. And so I'm trying to figure out how much could ultimately come from a tax credit.
Okay, in the case of the Christo Ray schools, it is a meaningful number. In the San Miguel Cristo Rey School in Tucson, it's close to $1 million that comes in on an operating budget. It's about $3.5 million, something like that. In the Nativity Miguel School, the cost per student, don't forget this is an 11-month program, summer program, taking the kids into summer camp someplace, is between $12,000 and $15,000. And so if we could get 9,000 of that, it still would be fundraising. But if we had that in place, that would then offer the platform from the business model standpoint to expand the model significantly.
Jeff, I might add that you might want to check with Indianapolis. Ron Costello, the superintendent, and Joe Peters, the associate executive director, have done a very detailed analysis of the new Indiana voucher program and compared it to cost per pupil in their various types of schools. Their analysis is one of the very best I've seen on paper to date.
Yeah, I haven't seen that.
Jeff, our school in Tucson gets $600,000 a year in tax credits. Our hopefully new school next year in Philadelphia is estimating between $500 and $750 when at full enrollment. And our look in Florida is it could be upwards of $1 million when we open a school there. Tucson, it's about 15% of their OpEx, and the Philly would be about the same, and Florida would be about 20 to 25%. In Arizona, it's $500 a family can deduct, a single person, $1,000 for a family, so that's what would go to the school. It's a little different in Arizona than the Philadelphia or the Pennsylvania and Florida. But it's significant. I mean, 20-25% of our OpEx makes our schools almost a profit center. Does that answer it, Jeff?
Think of the effect if all Catholic schools, not just the ones that we've mentioned here, had the ability to have this kind of revenue come in. It changes the environment completely.
Yes.
I have a question and a comment. Who is the actual recipient of a tax credit? I think of a tax credit on my personal income tax. I get a credit. Is that, and then I would turn that over to the school?
It goes into a independent organization that's formed to administrate this. Again, so the dollar doesn't go through the state hands. They go through this independent 501c organization that's set up as part of setting the program up.
So if I'm poor and I don't have enough income to pay taxes, but I want to send my kid to one of your schools, I don't qualify for the tax credit?
It varies state by state, and I don't think I can answer that question. All I know is
because then
Just to clarify, there are some, for example, where you might take tax deductions on your income tax. There are also corporate tax scholarships where businesses write off, and then those are distributed for scholarships.
you want the program to include corporations.
yeah, I can understand it if it includes corporations. If it's on an individual basis, it seems to me to be discriminatory against poor. And my comment would be, the rest of it would be that your comment that vouchers don't work. I'm from Wisconsin. They work great. They've been in place for a long time. We're expanding the program. So I probably should have been more clear on the comment. Vouchers work in Washington, D.C. We have a middle school that Washington Jesuit Academy that gets significant funding. But I think as because the construct of them and going through the bureaucracy is a nationwide effort, I would put all my emphasis on tax credits. One man's opinion.
Dick, if I could, the tax credit in Arizona, it isn't tied to my child. So my wife and I could give a tax credit to a scholarship fund designated to a school. The school gets the benefit, not tied to my children. Does that make sense?
I'm still trying to figure out why it's not discriminatory against poor people.
Well, the poor people get the benefit of it.
That's the whole idea. The recipients of this from the analytics is that that's where it's going. That's why we're all for it. Look, this varies state by state. But as Willie Sutton said in answering the question why rob banks, that's where the money is, and we have an opportunity to bring significant revenue into Catholic schools.
This is going to be our last question or comment. Second to last.
BJ, I was going to go there in terms of the discussion of tax credits versus vouchers. I just want to kind of put one comment on the table. I know that going for corporate-funded tax credits, which is what we're talking about in most cases, seems and feels more politically expedient and does feel less bureaucratic. But I want to make two comments. One is the average scholarship coming from those programs is not the average scholarship. It's not very high. And in Pennsylvania, the data suggests it's more middle class, partial scholarships than is the poor, which is why they're pushing the Opportunity Scholarships. So I just think we need to do both. And if it means pushing to the Blaine Amendment, I like to say, and I've had a lot of my brethren in the school choice movement yell at me about this, that the tax credits is tax reform and it's necessary, but vouchers is school reform. And having power in the hands of a parent, like my friend from Milwaukee can argue, is not just important for our schools, right? What it does for that parent that literally feels like they have something in their hand is cataclysmic in some cases. So I would argue respectfully that we need to do both and not to cede one.
I couldn't agree with you more. I have 15 minutes to talk, you know. We should be, but I mentioned your organization, that we should be part of that conversation. All I'm saying is, where's the low-hanging fruit, believe it or not, and it's the tax credits.
BJ, thank you for your work on, first of all your philanthropy, but also for bringing this important topic to our agenda. I would just have one comment that I think when you think about this strategy, that you obviously coordinate with the current efforts that are in place in many states. Right. But I'm wondering if you would see this new entity or effort beginning to encourage states where there is no activity to begin to work on tax credits strategies.
No, absolutely. That's why you would want a national
Right.
organization. I visualize a war room with all the states, and who are the Tiger teams on the ground working, like what you're doing in Delaware, as an example. And when you have the national perspective, and this is what works in Florida, this is what works in Ohio. There's a lot of intelligence gathering so that the strategies can be more focused. And again, I would stress we can't do it alone. We have the most schools, but talking about fighting the teachers' unions, we have to play the political game, and the political game has got to be not just Catholic. We got to get the Lutherans, the Jewish Orthodox, et cetera, and so we have a social justice issue that we're presenting, and part of that is to eliminate the discrimination of the inner city kids. No child left behind. Those kids are being left behind right now.
Yeah, clearly it has to be a strategy that embraces all advocates of non-public education.
Right.
But I also think that one of the things this Tiger team could do was to make sure that when the states actually begin to build their plan, they're actually building the best bill and proposal they could. So when it actually is enacted, there's real value as opposed to something.
All politics is local.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you.